A woman knelt in the mud and gripped a broken fence post with both hands, trying to pull it back into the ground before the storm hit. 3 boys stood behind her, soaked to the bone, watching their mother fight a piece of wood like it was the last wall between them and losing everything. She didn't hear the horse until it was almost on top of her. A rider pulled up at the edge of her land, rain running off his hat, and just sat there for a moment, looking at the scene in front of him. A widow, 3 sons, 1 fence that wasn't going to hold through the night. She stood up straight, wiped her hands on her skirt, and said the only thing she had left to say. "I have nothing left but 3 sons and a broken fence." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything that came after. "That's more than most men have in Montana." Nobody in that valley knew his name yet, but by the time this story is over, you'll understand why those 7 words mattered more than any fortune ever could. Before you find out who he was and why he stopped his horse on that exact stretch of road, hit subscribe. Because what happened over the next 2 years on that broken piece of land is the kind of story that doesn't get written in history books, but it should be. Let's go back 6 months earlier to understand how a woman ended up alone with 3 boys and a fence that wouldn't stand. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. And if you've ever watched someone you love carry a weight that should have been shared by 2 people, you already understand part of what she was living through. Her husband, Thomas, had built that homestead with his own hands, starting in the year of 1871. He'd staked the claim near the Yellowstone River in the Montana Territory, back when the land still belonged more to the wind than to any man's paper deed. Thomas Whitfield was not a rich man. He was a stubborn one. And in that country, stubborn was worth more than gold, because gold didn't plow fields or fix roofs before winter. For 6 years, Eleanor and Thomas built something out of nothing. A cabin, a barn, a herd of cattle that grew from 6 head to nearly 60. 3 sons were born in that cabin. Caleb, the oldest, was 10 years old. Micah was 7. And little Samuel, barely 5, still slept in the same room as his mother because the house only had 2 rooms to spare. Then, in the spring of that year, Thomas rode out to check the northern fence line after a bad storm, the kind that rolled down from the mountains and flattened everything in its path. He never came back. They found his horse 2 days later, grazing near the river, saddle empty. It took the men of the valley another 4 days to find Thomas himself, thrown from his horse against a rock ledge, his neck broken in the fall. The doctor said he likely died within minutes. Eleanor said she'd never fully believe it wasn't longer than that. Because a woman waiting for a knock on her door counts every second differently than anyone else. The funeral was small, a wooden cross, a few neighbors, and 3 boys who didn't fully understand yet that their father wasn't coming back to teach them how to break a horse or mend a roof. Caleb understood the most, and understanding the most at 10 years old meant he cried the least in front of his mother and the most alone behind the barn, where he thought nobody could hear him. Eleanor didn't have the luxury of a long grief. There was a herd to feed, a winter coming, and 3 boys looking to her now as the only wall standing between them and the world. She later told a neighbor that grief for a widow with children doesn't get canceled.
I'm so sorry.
It just gets postponed,
What do you do now?
pushed into the smallest hours of the night after the work is done and the boys are finally asleep. Here's where it gets worse. In Montana Territory, in that period, a widow's claim to land was not automatic. The homestead papers were filed under Thomas's name alone, as was common practice. Eleanor had helped build every fence post and every wall with her own hands. But on paper, she owned nothing until the claim could be legally transferred, a process that could take months, sometimes longer, especially for a woman with no lawyer and no money to pay one. While that paperwork sat untouched in some land office in Bozeman, Word got around, and in a territory hungry for good grazing land near a reliable water source, word travels fast and not always kindly. A local cattle baron named Franklin Ross Duke owned nearly everything north and east of Eleanor's homestead, and he did not build his fortune by being patient. Duke had tried twice before to buy out smaller ranchers who couldn't hold their land, and twice before it had worked. A widow with 3 young sons and no husband to speak for her looked, to a man like Duke, like the easiest deal he'd make all year. He rode out to her homestead less than 3 weeks after Thomas was buried. He didn't bring flowers or condolences. He brought papers and a low offer, wrapped up in words meant to sound like kindness. He told her the winter would be hard. He told her 3 boys couldn't run 60 head of cattle. He told her, more than once, that he was only trying to help a widow in a difficult position. Eleanor told him no. She stood on her own porch, in front of her own 3 sons, and told a man with more money than the whole valley combined that her land wasn't for sale. Not now. Not after what it cost her family to build it. Duke smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and he said something Eleanor never repeated to her sons until they were much older. He said the offer wouldn't stay on the table forever, and neither, he implied, would her fences. That was not an idle comment. Within a month, sections of her boundary fence, the one separating her land from Duke's grazing range, started coming down. Not all at once. A few posts here, a stretch of wire there. All was at night, always blamed on wind, or wolves, or bad luck, according to the men Duke sent to check on his cattle that always seemed to wander onto Eleanor's land right after. And what do if you're a woman with 3 sons, no husband, and a neighbor with more money and more men than you could ever match? You rebuild the fence every single time. Caleb, at 10 years old, learned to swing a post driver almost as well as a grown man. Micah, at 7, carried nails in a bucket and learned which knots held wire tight in a Montana wind. Samuel, the youngest, mostly watched and cried sometimes, though his mother never let him see her cry back. And here's the detail almost nobody tells you about frontier widows in this era. The law was rarely on their side, but the neighbors sometimes were, quietly when it counted. A woman 2 homesteads over, a widow herself from years before, brought Eleanor bread twice a week without being asked. An old trapper named Silas, who owed Thomas a debt from years back, would appear at the fence line some mornings with tools in hand and never ask for payment, just coffee if she had it to spare. There were nights that winter when Eleanor sat by the stove mending torn shirts by lamplight, listening to Samuel cough in his sleep, wondering if she was keeping her sons safe or slowly running them into the ground, trying to hold on to pride instead of peace. She never let them see that doubt. She saved it for the dark, the way most mothers in her position had to. But quiet kindness doesn't stop a man like Duke. By the time winter set back in, 6 months after Thomas died, Eleanor had lost 11 head of cattle to what the land office report called unclear circumstances. She had rebuilt that northern fence line 4 separate times, and she had, more than once, sat alone at her kitchen table after the boys were asleep, staring at Duke's unsigned offer, wondering if 3 tired boys and 1 battered piece of pride were really worth losing everything else. This is the night the story you heard at the start actually happened. A late spring storm rolled down off the mountains, the kind that turns solid ground into a river in under an hour. And of course, of all nights, that was the night the northern fence gave way completely. Posts snapped clean by wind and rot both. Wire tangled and useless in the mud. Eleanor didn't wait for morning. She grabbed a coat, told Caleb to watch his brothers, and walked out into the storm, alone, with a hammer, a handful of nails, and more stubbornness than sense. That's exactly where the rider found her. Soaked through, kneeling in the mud, fighting a fence post that outweighed her, while thunder cracked over a valley that had taken almost everything from her already. His name was Walter Greer. He wasn't a rich man either. He was a former Army scout turned drifting rancher, the kind of man who showed up in a territory owning little more than a good horse, a decent rifle, and a reputation that traveled slightly ahead of him, for honesty mostly, and for not backing down when it mattered. He'd been riding through on his way to a job further west, a foreman position on a cattle drive that would have paid him steady money for the first time in years. But here's the open loop I promised you earlier. That job never happened. Because Walter Greer got off his horse that night, picked up a second hammer from her tool bag without asking permission, and started driving posts back into the mud beside her in the pouring rain, saying almost nothing until the fence held again. When it was done, near midnight, both of them soaked and freezing, Eleanor asked him plainly why a stranger would stop to fix a fence that wasn't his in the middle of a storm. And that's when he said it. "I have nothing left but 3 sons and a broken fence," she'd said earlier, almost to herself, almost in surrender. He looked at her, at the mud on her hands, at the exhausted determination that hadn't broken even after 6 months of losing, and he said, "That's more than most men have in Montana." He meant it plainly. 3 sons willing to work themselves raw for their mother. A fence rebuilt 5 times over by a woman most men would have expected to give up after the first. That, to Walter Greer, who had buried men with far less waiting for them back home, sounded like wealth most ranchers in that territory would never know. He didn't leave the next morning. Now, before I tell you what Walter did next, and what it cost him, answer me this in the comments. If you were in Eleanor's position, would you have kept fighting? Or would you have taken Duke's offer just to protect your children from more danger? I want to know. Because what happens next split this valley right down the middle. Walter stayed on as hired help, for wages Eleanor could barely afford, though he never once complained about the pay. He worked the fence line daily. He taught Caleb how to read brand marks on stray cattle. He taught Micah how to track a wolf's path through frost without disturbing it. He even got quiet, careful Samuel to laugh again, which Eleanor said was the first time she'd heard that sound since the funeral. But Duke noticed a hired hand, turned rancher settling into land he'd been trying to steal for months. And Duke did not like being outmaneuvered by a woman and a drifter with no legal claim to anything. He sent men to intimidate Walter directly this time. 3 of Duke's ranch hands rode onto Eleanor's land one afternoon, while Walter was alone repairing the barn roof. They made it clear, without saying it outright, that Walter should ride on before something happened that couldn't be walked back. Walter didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't threaten them either. He simply climbed down from the roof, looked each man in the eye, and told them that he'd buried better men than Duke in worse ground than this, and he wasn't in the business of running from bullies twice in one lifetime. They left, but everyone in that valley knew Duke wasn't finished. Here's where the story turns, because 2 weeks later, Walter did something nobody expected, including Eleanor. He rode the nearly 50 miles to the land office in Bozeman himself, on his own horse, on his own time, and using the last of his own savings. He paid a lawyer to formally push through Eleanor's claim transfer, the paperwork that had been sitting untouched for 6 months, while Duke tried to bully her off land that was rightfully becoming hers. It took the lawyer, a sharp, unglamorous man named Elias Cormack, less than 3 weeks to force the Bozeman land office to recognize Eleanor Whitfield as the legal and sole owner of her homestead, citing the improvements she and her sons had made to the property with their own labor, a legal argument rarely used successfully by widows in that decade, but not unheard of when someone was willing to fight for it properly. When Walter rode back onto her land and handed her that paper, Eleanor read it twice, standing in the yard before she believed it was real. For the first time since Thomas died, the land was hers. Not pending, not disputed.
I can't believe it.
Hers, on paper, in a court that Duke could no longer argue with, no matter how much land he owned around her. Duke tried one final move. He offered to buy the land at double his original price, now that Eleanor legally owned it outright, probably assuming grief and exhaustion would finally win out where intimidation had failed. Eleanor said no again, but this time, she wasn't alone when she said it. By the following spring, 1 full year after that storm, the fence Eleanor and Walter had rebuilt together held through every wind Montana threw at it. The herd had grown back to nearly 40 head. Caleb, now 11, ran cattle drives half a day's ride with growing confidence. Micah tracked game well enough to feed the family through most of a hard winter. And Samuel, 6 years old now, followed Walter everywhere on the property like a shadow that had finally found somewhere safe to land. Walter Greer never did take that foreman job further west. He stayed on that homestead, married Eleanor 2 years after the night of the storm, in a small ceremony attended by half the valley, including, oddly enough, the widow who'd once brought Eleanor bread twice a week without being asked. Franklin Ross Duke eventually moved his operations further south after losing 3 separate land disputes in that county over the following decade. Disputes historians in the region still cite as early, if imperfect, examples of homestead law slowly beginning to favor those who worked land with their own hands, rather than those who simply claimed it on paper. And that broken fence, the one Eleanor was kneeling in the mud fighting to save the night Walter rode up, sections of the original wood, replaced and reinforced many times over across the decades, reportedly still stood on that Montana property well into the following century, according to local accounts passed down through the Whitfield and Greer family line. So here's what I want you to sit with. Eleanor Whitfield never lost her land because she gave up. She nearly lost it because the system wasn't built to protect a woman doing everything right. What saved her wasn't luck, and it wasn't charity either. It was one stranger who looked past what she didn't have and saw clearly what she did. If this story moved you even a little, tell me in the comments what that line meant to you. That's more than most men have in Montana. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the quiet, unglamorous kind of courage the Old West rarely got credit for, subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started, and there are a lot more fences left to rebuild. This video is an artistic recreation created with the help of artificial intelligence, developed independently for entertainment and educational purposes. For precise historical accuracy, please consult official historical sources and records.